Well, welcome everyone. We'll get started in another minute or so. Thank you for joining us.
And Meg, if you want to launch that first poll, then we'll get a sense of who is joining us today. Welcome and thanks for joining us. We will get started in just another minute. Hopefully you see a poll in front of you on your screen. We're just trying to find out a couple quick things about you, where you are zooming in from, and whether you feel you're a forester, scientist, other. So please take a quick moment and fill that out. We'll get started as soon as, oh, my clock just changed over. So I'm gonna count down from 10, and then we'll close the poll and get started. So counting backward, this is your last chance to fill out the poll. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Dink. All right. Meg, would you mind closing the poll and sharing the results with us? All right. So almost half of us are coming in from Maine. A third are coming in from somewhere in the New England region. Almost 1 in 5 are from outside of New England. The majority consider ourselves to be foresters. We also have a really nice mix of scientists, forest-related industry or managers, interested public policy, recreation-related, and conservation-related. All right, so thank you so much. All right, and I'm sure we have a couple more people that will be zooming in slightly after the top of the hour. I'm going to turn it over to Aaron for the official welcome.
Well, thank you, Amanda, and thank you for everyone joining us. Sounds like this has been a back-to-back, at least, climate change events in Maine. We're very excited with the Science in Practice and appreciate everyone joining us for it. I think it's really been a great forum. This is already our third one, so we're kind of 3 months into this venture. We started off with Keith Canody talking through safe wood and not so safe wood. And then last month we had Dan Hayes and Adam Dagno talking through carbon budgets and carbon policies. I think this topic, we kind of put it here, not trying to forecast the weather, but obviously it's a beautiful sunny day and was quite the weather event the last 2 days. So I think joining us today is Drs. Sarah Nelson and Jay Wason, who I'll introduce briefly in a bit. I just wanted to remind people that on the website at the bottom, you can look at these past webinars as well as materials associated with the current webinar, and we'll keep this going. January, we'll bring in Drs. Amanda Cross and Aaron Simons-Lagarde to talk about climate change and biodiversity and habitat concerns. But this one is focused on changing and warming winters and tree physiology, which I think is an exciting topic given the winter that we're kind of facing ahead. Before I want to jump in, I just want to acknowledge that the CRS, the Center for Research in Sustainable Forests, supports forest research and education on the traditional territories of the Penobscot Nation and other Wabanaki tribal nations. We just think it's critical to be mindful of these forest lands. We're home to these indigenous people and are really want to value a community where these kind of non-Western science and values are present. So with that, today we'll be talking about changing warming winters and tree physiology, and this will be, again, an interactive format led by Amanda Mahaffey. This is a joint venture between the University of Maine Center for Research on Sustainable Forest, as well as Amanda Mahaffey's Forest Stewardship Guild. She'll be facilitating this meeting as before, and we'll try to make it as interactive and keep the hour moving along as rapidly. Today, as I mentioned, we're joined by the Appalachian Mountain Club's Director of Science, Dr. Sarah Nelson, who was a former faculty member here at the University of Maine, and Dr. Jay Wason, who joined us about 3 years ago as an assistant professor of tree physiology. So with that, I look forward to today's meeting and turn it over to Amanda.
All right, thanks so much for that intro, Erin. So we're excited to have everybody here. You're going to get a really nice fall, winter, spring look at tree physiology and changing and warming winters. So if you have questions, please type them into the chat window. We're going to address the questions after the presentations, but in the meantime, we'll have a couple of questions for you. So stay tuned. I'm going to turn off my camera, but I will be with you. So take it away, Sarah and Jay.
I just needed to unmute there for a minute. Great, thank you for the introduction and for putting together this series. We're really excited to be here today and to have the opportunity to present about how seasons are changing with a focus on winter. As mentioned, I'm Sarah Nelson. I'm the Director of Research at the Appalachian Mountain Club. And again, prior to that was at the University of Maine. I'm now a little bit on the other side of the mountains, but can almost see Maine from where I sit. And co-presenting is Dr. Jay Wason, if you want to.
Yep, so I'm Jay Wason. I've been at the University of Maine for 3 years now in the School of Forest Resources, and my research covers a range of topics from forest ecology, now bridging into more tree physiology and responses to climate change and extreme events. So as Sarah goes through some of the changes that we're seeing in these seasons, I'm going to be bringing in some perspectives on what trees are doing at those times of year as well.
Great, so jumping right into it, whether we're considering just really the northeastern US or the continent as a whole, scientists have really converged on a few major findings regarding climate change. First, climate is warming, and this is sort of the trace of the graph showing that process and what's been going on here in climate across the US and in fact globally. The Northeast is of course part of that. Climate is changing a little bit differently in different places, but we do see warming all across the US. And for today, we'll zoom in a little bit to the Northeast, and I've got some facts and figures about Maine from the recent Maine Climate Council Science and Technical Subcommittee report. So in Maine overall, the entire year on average has risen about 3.2 degrees Fahrenheit over the past little over 120 or so years. And so this is the annual averages, not just what's happening in winter or any particular season. And one of the other key changes that has been happening nationally and in many cases globally is increasing precipitation. So you've already heard the word extremes or extreme events. There are some different definitions for these, but in general, we're talking about large events that happen over the course of a day, a 24-hour period. In some fields of research, it's related to a percentile, so the 90th percentile rainstorm, for example. And one of the key pieces about the northeastern US is that we have been either the first or second in the country in terms of increases in these extreme events, increases in frequency. So we've witnessed a lot of these increases in extremes over the past century, and we can all probably think of a time that your driveway or your road has really blown out due to a huge rainstorm. We've had a lot of rain even this week. And in fact, Maine has had a 6-inch increase in precipitation overall since 1895. So we are seeing both increasing temperatures and increasing precipitation and frequency of extreme events here in the Northeast and in Maine. But just like the changes that we see can be different in different regions, they can also be different in different seasons. So the data I just showed were largely averages over the course of a year. And today we're going to present you with some of the changes that we're seeing in the Northeast that relate to specific seasons, especially winter and its shoulder seasons, fall and spring. And then what those changes could mean for forests that are adapted to our shifting seasons. So we want to have a conversation with all of you about what the changes will mean for the resources that you work with every day and how you're thinking about making changes in light of how winters and shoulder seasons will continue to change. So Amanda will be bringing up some polls as we have time to discuss some of that in more detail. So which of the first poll that we had planned here was to ask you which of the following winter changes would be most of concern or most disruptive to you in your work. And hopefully we can get that launched. And if not, you can think about this and we'll get that poll going. Oh, there it is. So multiple choice here, and we're interested in hearing whether you're thinking no snow cover on the ground, unfrozen ground, a longer mud season, more freeze and thaw patterns, more localized patterns, lots of choices here. So we'll just pause and give you a little bit of time to think about that.
I'll just mention, if you scroll down, then you'll see another couple of questions that are related as well. So if you've completed the first question, make sure you scroll down and catch questions 2 and 3. Thanks.
Lots of choices here. So Amanda, are we doing a countdown?
I think I'll do a countdown. Let's see. We're going to count back from 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Bink. Meg is going to close the poll and then share those results with us. Thanks, Meg.
Great. So looks like lots of folks have already noticed changes in the variability that we mentioned in terms of extremes, and we'll dig into that in a moment as well. Freeze and thaw. And it looks like in the second question, which was kind of the one I was highlighting here, was a lot of responses across all of those concerns: the warm snaps, shorter winter, warmer temperatures, unfrozen ground, no snow on the ground. Longer mud season is the slight winner, I guess, if we had to pick one. So we'll cover what's actually been going on in terms of our changing winters and those shoulder seasons. Jumping in, and it seems like there'll be something here for everyone given those responses. There we go. So some of the changes that you all highlighted really are those that are already happening. And again, they happen not just in the winter, but in the shoulder seasons too. So I worked with an interdisciplinary team over the past few years where we looked at winter weather whiplash, and we really defined this class of extreme events as those where there's a collision of unexpected conditions that produce a forceful, rapid back and forth change in winter weather that induces an outsized impact on coupled human and natural systems. So thinking across disciplines, we worked with biophysical and social scientists and defined these winter weather whiplash events. So we'll start in the fall with one of these types of events, which we called snow on leaf in this working group. And so here's what that can look like. And we actually just had a pretty similar event to this Snowtober, which was kind of the big famous one that happened in October of 2011. And this gets to the outsized impact piece of winter weather whiplash. So in October 2011, we had a couple of feet of snow right around Halloween, and actually resulted in Halloween being canceled in a number of towns. 2 feet of snow isn't that unusual for New England. We've had plenty of 2-foot snowstorms, but the issue and why this became a fall winter weather whiplash event was due to the timing. So it was when it was unexpected, both for humans and for the natural ecosystems. The snow fell while leaves were still on the tree canopy. And actually the implications turned out to be huge from this Snowtober in 2011. There were more than 3 million households and businesses lost power. A lot of this happened actually in southern New England in terms of the power outages, and it really wreaked havoc. So getting winter conditions outside of winter in the fall and the shoulder season is a winter weather whiplash event that has potentially huge implications. So I will hand it over to Jay to talk about what this means for plants.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so I'm less worried that everybody lost power. I'm more worried what happened to the plants during that event, right? And so plants, I wanted to spend just a brief moment reminding us what trees in particular are trying to do and why an event like Sarah's talking about can have such a big impact on them. And then we'll talk about what plants are doing at that specific times of year. So when you think about a plant, they have a couple of things they're trying to do, but for the most part, they're just trying to get carbon into themselves in order to build themselves, to make themselves taller and stronger and make them able to defend themselves more carefully, and also for reproduction. And so it's all about carbon when you start thinking about trees and the balance that they're trying to play here. And so during the summertime, they've got their leaves out and they're sequestering carbon all year, and then they're allocating that carbon to different places. And so this is where this term spend money to make money comes in. The trees have to decide where are they going to take that carbon that they've sequestered into themselves as sugars. Are they going to use it to build more wood? Are they going to store it maybe in their root system so they can use it next year to do something? Or are they going to turn right around and use it for reproduction that current year? And so when an event like Sarah's talking about comes in and damages a whole large portions of these trees, it really messes with that carbon balance and carbon allocation strategy with trees. And so this diagram here is just showing the fact that leaves and trees are really specifically adapted to bring carbon dioxide into the plants. And there's a whole set of characteristics related to that in order to provide water to those leaves that they need for photosynthesis, and then also to remove the sugars that those leaves are producing. And so we'll come back to this idea throughout the rest of the slides today. You can go to the next one, Sarah. So let's talk specifically about what trees are doing in the fall. And so most importantly, they're trying to read the environment. They're trying to predict when fall is arriving and when winter is coming. And they do a couple of things. One is they can actually detect day length. And so they have these molecules inside of them called phytochromes. And these phytochromes are molecules that basically just change their shape based on how much light they receive throughout the day. And then they slowly change form again all night. And so based on the ratio of certain shapes of or the concentrations of these molecules in different shapes, the plants can actually tell how long the days are. And so we know that day length gets shorter here in Maine in the fall, and so plants can actually detect that. They can also detect colder temperatures by similar mechanisms. And so a combination of those two things is what triggers this fall color that we're so well known for in the Northeast. Next, Sarah. And so when they start detecting that winter is coming, they do several things to prepare for winter. So one of the things they do is resorb the nutrients that are inside of their leaves. And so leaves are really expensive. They build these leaves in order to sequester that carbon all summer, but it's really hard to get all those nutrients up into the plant. And so they actually resorb about 50% of the nutrients in those leaves back into their bodies and store it for use in the following year. And then they drop the remaining portions of their leaves. And that picture Sarah showed, one of the major reasons that impacted trees is that leaves provide a lot of surface area for that snow to fall on and can create heavy snow loads that certain species are not well adapted to. They also begin storing that carbon. They want to save some money to spend next year because they need to produce new leaves in the spring and the following year. But plants are alive. Let's not forget that these trees are very living beings. Even the wood inside trees, the sapwood is very much alive. And so all of those cells need to be able to withstand freezing and the very, very cold temperatures associated with winter. So they developed this thing called cold hardiness, which is a series of adaptations that they have in order to limit the damage to these living cells. Think about taking a leaf of lettuce, for example, and putting it into your freezer. It's really going to damage all of those cells. Next slide, sir. Next. Yep. And so they're really trying to time this right. There's a balancing act here where if they wait longer, they could potentially take advantage of a longer growing season. But if they wait too long, then they could risk a lot of damage associated with a late winter event or a frost event that can kill those leaves and maybe prevent them from resorbing those nutrients or being able to store the carbon in other more permanent structures. There's a recent paper that just came out actually looking at some climate change effects on leaf drop in trees. and found some evidence that perhaps the higher productivity in the growing season from having a longer growing season and more time to be more productive for trees in the summertime may actually lead to earlier leaf drop because they kind of reach saturation in some way. So there's certainly lots more complexities related to the summertime that actually influences the fall as well. Okay.
All right.
Oh yeah, I got one more. We go back at accounting. So, I mean, this just comes down to thinking about why trees do what they do at certain times of year. It seems a little bit simple to think about, but why don't they build new leaves in September? It's this whole idea of investing in that leaf. It's very expensive to invest in that leaf, and you're not going to get a lot of payback from that leaf if you build new ones in September. So that's simply why they even build leaves in the springtime. It's all about that carbon balance. Okay, thank you, Sarah.
Right. So in that kind of build up toward winter, we're already seeing some climate changes occurring. And as Jay just sort of mentioned and went through, that really can set up the forest in different ways to experience winter. Winter itself is changing. Winter conditions are really changing across the northern forest already. And here are kind of the punchlines, and then I'll provide you with some of the evidence and information we've been pulling together to look at how winters themselves are changing. Winter is warming faster than any other season in Eastern North America, as well as in some other regions. I worked with a team who examined 100 years of past winter temperature and precipitation data from weather stations across the Northeast, going all the way over to sort of the Great Lakes states and then up into the Eastern Canadian provinces. And we examined what's been happening in terms of winter across our region. And really what we found is that we're losing snowpack, we're losing snow, and we're losing cold over the last century. So we'll jump into some of those winter changes. I'm showing this map in the upper right-hand corner that shows all of the weather stations we use that had 100 years of data that we needed for our trend analysis. And then I have a few plots and maps like this on the bottom of this slide, where I'm showing a winter indicator. So in this case, we developed an indicator called frost days, which are days when the minimum temperature dropped below 0 degrees Celsius or 32 Fahrenheit, dropped below freezing. And we counted the number of days in each year where that minimum temperature dropped below freezing. And then we could compare that through the 100 years. We broke up the region into 3 areas: West, Central, and East. So New England and New York are in the eastern piece of that region. And on the map, the size of the dots are telling us the rate of change in the number of those very cold days, frost days. And so what we see when we add it up is, particularly in the eastern region, which we would think of as the Northeast, all of the red lines in the trend plot are trending down, meaning fewer frost days, significantly fewer frost days in the past 100 years. And what that boils down to is about 3 weeks of fewer frost days in the Northeast. And in particular, the one Maine station where we analyzed these data had 26 fewer frost days since 1917. So we're losing those cold nights. Times when the temperature dips below freezing is almost always at night. Cold nights are what keeps our snowpack around and just cues everything into the fact that it's cold out there. So we're losing cold temperatures. And again, kind of pulling out Maine for those in the audience, slightly more folks from Maine in the audience today than other locations. Maine's winters are also warming faster than other seasons. So in a little more than 100 years, the overall minimum temperature increased 4 degrees Fahrenheit, and winter temperatures increased just over 5 degrees Fahrenheit in Maine, again, from the new Maine Climate Council report. And thinking about 5 degrees, if you're in an area where it kind of hovers around the freezing mark anyway in winter, like the coast of Maine, an increase of 5 degrees can be what flips you into a non-frozen state. So these are pretty big numbers in terms of increasing winter temperatures, minimum or cold temperatures. And we've seen that we've lost cold temperatures in winter across the Northeast, with about 2 to 3 weeks lost over the century. And we've been working on projections across Maine with collaborator Liz Burikowski at UNH, who has just been working up all of the most recent projections and sent me some projections for Maine for this talk. So here's a graphic showing projections, or what we expect could be the future picture about Maine over the next about 80 years until 2099, the rest of this century. And this graphic is showing for Jackman, Maine, the northernmost site I sent her to take a look at. The first section of the graph here in gray is the existing data, so we can look at what has been happening since 1980, and then picks up and looks at what will happen in terms of the number of those frost days, the cold days, over the next 80 years. The red line is showing us the more extreme scenario. If our emissions pathway kind of stays the course with high emissions. The blue line is showing us our slower greenhouse gas emissions scenario. And the emissions pathway really does make a difference. So we stand to lose potentially about 3 more weeks of these cold days if we slow our greenhouse gas emissions. But if we continue on the high emissions pathway, the red line here, we would see an additional 3 weeks of frost days lost by 2100. So that would really be a doubling of the rate of change we saw over the last century. Jump ahead. Oh, and yeah, so these lines are showing us sort of the approximate 3 weeks lost depending on the scenario that we're looking at. And we're developing these projections across Maine's climate divisions, which if you've ever driven from Acadia to the Allagash, you know how different Maine's weather and climate can be. And we see the loss of cold happening really all across the state. So here's the same type of graph, the number of frost days at Bangor Airport, which is in the interior climate division, and for Acadia National Park, which is on the coast. And at the coast, specifically for this Acadia site, we would see the number of total frost days dipping below 3 months total, really shortening the winter season for Acadia in the next 80 years. So cold temperatures, of course, are what we need for snow to fall and also for snow to persist on the ground as snowpack. So in this 100-year looking backwards assessment, looking at trends of what has happened up until now, we also assessed how the number of snow-covered days, which is the total number of days each winter when there's snow on the ground, how that has changed. And snow-covered days have also declined by about 19 days in 100 years. So again, pretty close to 3 weeks. Here in Maine, a little bit more than 3 weeks of snow-covered days in terms of their decline. So we've lost days with snow cover as well as days with cold. Kind of logical, but interesting to see those trends play out. And again, the Northeast tended to have the most coherent trends. More of the sites were declining significantly across our region and really strongly. So again, for Maine, we can look at a figure that was in the last Maine's Climate Future report in 2015, where they showed potential declines in snowfall depending on Maine's climate division. So those 3 very different climate divisions from the coast to up north and inland. And projections were potential declines in snowfall up to 40% along the coast. So the new projections that Dr. Burikowski just modeled are showing us again the example for Acadia, where here we can see those kind of reductions in snow cover in the next few decades play out, and potentially dramatically less snow by the end of the century, especially for that high emissions pathway, if greenhouse gas emissions aren't slowed in the next couple of decades. So again, we're developing those projections in the different locations, and we see even for northernmost in our assessment, there's a lot of Maine north of Jackman stations that were projected to continue losing snow, which has a lot of implications for snow-dependent wildlife, businesses, people, traditions, our culture in Maine. And so all these changes to cold temperatures and in snowpack add up to really shorter winters across the Northeast. And so here we're summarizing again across those 3 regions what winters now look like in this graph that we call a wedge plot. So going from the top to the bottom, we're going through time from the 19 teens to 2017, looking at the last century's trend. And the red lines are showing significantly later onset of cold and snow in the fall and earlier warming or snowmelt in spring. And so kind of showing how that plays out in terms of this wedge formed by these trends is narrowing. It's showing us this shorter winter. And this is largely due to later spring onset, but fall, the development of winter and fall has been getting a little bit later as well. So now we'll jump to thinking about what trees are doing over these winters.
Yeah, so trees, mostly like anyone here that hasn't had their lunch yet, you're just trying to stay alive. You're starting to feel very hungry. And so for trees, it's the same kind of thing. All summer, they're sequestering carbon and they're basically filling their bellies in some way you can think about. And then all winter, they need to try to wait it out and get through that long period of time. They certainly don't get anywhere close to carbon starvation going through the winter, but they do have stored carbon reserves that they're using up just to maintain themselves and keep themselves alive over the winter. Sarah, if you can click forward, I think 2 times. 1 more. Yep. So they are burning carbon. One of the unique things about trees and plants more generally that's different from humans. Humans, we maintain a relatively constant internal temperature, so the rates of reactions in our bodies are relatively stable, related to temperature at least, whereas trees are much more closely tied to their outside environment. So the rates of the reactions in trees actually changes based on the outside temperature. And so in the winter time, trees are not photosynthesizing, they're respiring just like we are. So they're burning energy and releasing carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. So if you actually have a warmer winter, that actually increases the rate of that respiration for those trees. And so they actually can release more carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere just from having warmer temperatures. And so this is one of the complexities of climate change that we don't often think about. The other important thing that they're doing is trying to maintain their cold tolerance. And so this graphic here on the top right is showing for red spruce growing in Vermont, how they develop cold tolerance throughout one growing season. And so in August, they're not very tolerant to cold temperatures. You can see the y-axis showing the temperature that those shoots could survive at. Whereas when we get down to December and January, those shoots are really, really cold tolerant. They can handle temperatures down to about -40 degrees Celsius. But this varies quite a bit by species as well. And so in that table, you can see that red spruce actually is one of the least cold hardy conifers that we have in the northeastern United States. Species like hemlock, spruce, and pine can handle much colder temperatures in terms of their absolute minimum temperatures they can survive in the wintertime. And then the other effect that Sarah mentioned was we're losing snow, and that's really important for insulating root systems. So that cold tolerance that I'm showing you there is really just related to the shoots and the above ground tissues. Roots do not really develop strong cold tolerance in the wintertime, so any sub-zero temperatures or much below 0 temperatures tend to begin damaging roots. And so that nice insulating layer of snow can be really important for limiting damage to fine roots. Can you click 1 more time, Sarah? And so they're really trying to time things correctly, also to make sure that they emerge and produce new leaves in the spring at the right time. So they have what's called chilling requirements that helps them know if they've been through a relatively cold period of time, so they feel like they've made it through the whole winter. But there can be these midwinter thaw events, like a recent event in Wisconsin where they had really warm temperatures for about a week. And actually about half of the woody species that were on this campus where these scientists were monitoring this began to initiate some of their spring phenology in the middle of February. And so those types of things can really mess with the plant's ability to detect and understand what the environmental conditions are. And that's where these whiplash and major changes can really impact trees. Okay.
Great. So Yeah, our final season for today's talk, thinking about spring. And as Jay just mentioned, thinking about climate change, whether it's human systems or natural systems and forests, in a way, it's all about kind of expectations. So when are people thinking that these changes will occur, and when are they expecting to do their normal processes? And so spring has been beginning earlier. And we can tell that from evidence like phenology indicators, like first leaf date or first bloom dates for certain plants that are monitored by the National Phenology Network. And in this graphic, it's showing national parks all across the country where phenology data were available for leaf out date and bloom dates for specific plants. And all of the red and yellow colors are telling us that those phenological indicators, those plant processes are happening earlier. So we're seeing earlier springs nationwide and in the Northeast. The big yellow trace in this graphic is the Appalachian Trail, which has some monitoring all along its length. It's kind of a noticeable feature there. So in addition to earlier spring in terms of plant ecology, we're also seeing increases in the length of mud season, again on the order of a few weeks across most of the Northeast. And mud season is not, of course, just about muddy boots, but has implications for forest harvesting, for recreation on trails, you name it. And those of us in Maine and other North Country locations surely know some of the issues with mud season. So mud days when we don't have snow on the ground and the temperature does not dip below freezing, have also increased 2 days per decade in that past 100 years. This was also found in a separate study in Wisconsin, where frozen ground period was shorter by 2 to 3 weeks since 1948. And there is an indication in some climate studies that the rates of change have been accelerating. So the more recent period, the last 50 years or so, have been changing more quickly in a lot of locations and regions. So it's kind of important to keep that in mind as we think about what changes we may see in the future. And as Jay just mentioned, again, winter weather whiplash, these wildly swinging weather patterns have also been happening in spring. And especially in spring, we get sometimes dramatic warm-ups followed by a snap back to what would be a normal cold condition. And the recently released, again, report from the Maine Climate Council notes these events. While we still don't know how frequent they'll become, we do know that when they happen, they have those outsized effects that are characteristic of the winter weather whiplash phenomenon. So I'll talk briefly about a spring winter weather whiplash case study as an example of this. So for example, in the year 2012, there was an event called the False Spring, and it caused millions of dollars of damage to fruit trees across the northern tier. The ingredients for that winter weather whiplash event were a really warm February and a record-breaking warm March. It actually hit 80 degrees. I camped in my yard, which is not a normal thing to do in Bangor in March without kind of having your heavy-duty sleeping bag. And we also don't normally see scientific articles calling something out as epic, but the number of records broken in March 2012 was indeed epic. So we had this warm February and March, during which a lot of plants, not just fruit trees, but fruit trees budded early, and fruit trees, started producing the delicate buds that would become fruit. And the next thing that happened, the final ingredient, was we got that normal cold temperature back. We had a hard frost in April. What happened then is it killed all of those buds and decimated the fruit tree crops across New England and in the upper Midwest. And it was actually damaged to the tune of about $500 million for just apple trees in Michigan, and $71 million to multiple kinds of fruit trees in the Northeast. So this was a really big event. and just showed what can happen when we get warm weather out of phase with what we and what plants expect. When we get non-winter weather when it normally should be winter. So turning it back over to Jay for a debrief on that.
Yeah, and related to that too, so there's value in plants being able to leaf out earlier if conditions are warmer, right? That allows them to take advantage of changing seasons and changing spring times. But in some cases, being less adaptable or responding less quickly to some of those events can be a benefit as well when we know that those cold temperatures are returning as well. So that gets to this first point here, is plants are in the springtime really trying to determine if it's spring or not. And so they have a couple of cues that they can use to determine whether they think it's spring or not. One is these chilling requirements I mentioned, so they can kind of detect how much cold they've been through and if that seems like it's been a normal winter and it's safe to emerge. The other are longer days. So just like how they can detect shorter days in the fall, they can detect the days lengthening in the spring. And that's certainly something that we don't expect to change from climate change. The length of the days is relatively stable. So that can be a marker point for trees and other plants. And thirdly, they detect the warming of temperatures. And that's something that can really accelerate things if you get it out of phase for sure. And so in the springtime, this graph on the right here is depicting what time of year relative to soil and air temperatures plants begin to do the stuff they do. So are they starting to grow roots? Are they starting to break bud? And are they starting to expand leaves? And one of the interesting things about roots in particular is roots tend to grow whenever conditions are good. They don't grow necessarily at predictable times of year, but if it's relatively warm, typically above about 5 degrees Celsius in the soil, if it's moist and if they've got the carbon available, so if they've got stored carbon reserves from the previous year that can be expended, then those trees can grow new roots, for example. And so in the springtime, really timing it right is good for this race that we were talking about and this carbon balance that these trees are trying to meet here, where they need to produce these new leaves, spend a whole bunch of carbon to produce them in order to reap those rewards. And if you time that wrong and you invest a lot in those leaves and they're damaged by a late spring frost, for example, that can have really negative consequences. And so that's this balance between early leaf out and allowing you to take advantage of a longer growing season, but a higher risk of frost damage versus leafing out too late. And then you're missing a whole window of opportunity and you're no longer competitive. And that starts to shift the competitive dominance in that ecosystem. Okay. Yep, so to summarize that, can trees leaf out sooner with climate change? Yes. Will they leaf out sooner with climate change? Maybe. It's really going to depend on the species. And that's really going to start to shift our ecosystems in kind of unique ways. Okay, thanks. Sir.
Yeah, so to sum up what we've been discussing before we jump into some questions and discussion, winter climate change, whether it's happening during winter or during the shoulder seasons, fall and spring, it really is poised to fundamentally reshape our ecosystems as well as our social systems, our cultural, experiences of winter in the northern forest. In the fall, we talked about winter weather whiplash events like Snowtober of 2011, and Jay mentioned how that can do extreme weather damage to trees before the leaves drop. During the winter itself, we've documented through multiple lines of evidence shorter winters, loss of cold temperatures, loss of snow cover and snowpack. And we think these trends, based on all of the analyses that are being done at multiple scales, these trends will continue and they really could also accelerate, but part of that depends on greenhouse gas emission trajectories and scenarios. And as Jay mentioned, maintaining cold tolerance is important during the winter, as well as those chilling requirements for tree species adapted to cold temperatures. And then as we go into spring, we've also documented earlier spring onset, so spring starting earlier, which can lead to more mud days, as well as, again, these extreme events like the fall spring of 2012. And the risk there for our forests is late spring frost damage. And so to summarize, we wanted to thank funders. We wanted to thank FCCI for inviting us to speak today and talk about this work. And we can turn it back over to Amanda to facilitate Q&A.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Jay. There's been a lot of great chat coming into the chat window. Instead of just the polls, we had I had a couple of questions about, what changes have you seen in, in winters, or what changes have you seen in spring or mud season conditions? And we've had some really interesting observations that really echoed the data that both of you were sharing. So where to begin? I think going back to winter, we had some questions about ice and ice damage, questions about or comments that related to snow depth and snow cover duration, and also comments about fewer sub-zero mornings. This might kind of be summed up in Carbo's first comment that he made. So Carbo shared, he says, "I'm concerned about the stress caused on species that have evolved to spend winter in a deep snow cover. My observational science tells me that some of the decline I am observing, in particular in hardwoods, could be driven by these rapid changes in the lack of snow and damage to the roots and associated soil organisms. This decline is magnified by damage done during logging with less snow and cold, allowing more soil compaction, etc." So for Sarah or for Jay, what would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I can jump in and say, yep, I think that's certainly something we need to be concerned about. But also the lack of the insulating layer of snow actually changes the chemistry of the soils too. So the soils are doing, and I won't pretend to be a soil chemist, and I won't call on some of the soil chemists that are here today to explain all of that, but it even changes nutrient availability in those soils. And so it's not always just damage directly to the root systems, for example, but bringing the microorganisms is an important aspect as well.
Thanks. Sarah, do you want to add to that at all?
No, I think I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I think definitely echoes some of the data you were sharing about changes in snow cover duration, et cetera. And by the way, folks, if you have questions, please type them into the chat window. We do have plenty of time to answer your questions, and I'm sure you don't have all the answers right now. So this is your chance. Ask away. Just another comment, I guess, was on spring. Let's see. So Tom Charles shared, he says, "I think the late winter major thaws have been even more damaging than the early leaves and blooms. However, early warmth plus increasingly varied temperatures can cause big problems. February to May 2010 was the mildest I've experienced since moving to Maine in 1973, but mid-May included 3 straight mornings in the upper 20s, mid to upper 20s, major kill of blossoms and early leaves." So I'd love for someone to comment on the kind of the increasing variation in temperatures, can cause big problems, part of that. So Sarah or Jay, comments?
Yeah, I think I like the idea of thinking about this in terms of problems too. So we perceive these things as major negatives sometimes, but at the same time, most kind of mature, for example, mature hardwood trees around here, you could defoliate them probably 3 or 4 times and they have enough carbon reserves to reflush. And so as we perceive them as a problem, we see that there's damage to these trees, and we think that feels bad to us, and they shouldn't be going through that. But in the end, it's really changing the dynamics of the system in some ways. And those trees are really resilient in a lot of ways to these changes. But for example, if you do have flower buds that year that get damaged, you're not going to have flowers that year. It's going to be another few years before you get those flowers back, depending on that individual species. Yeah, so I think it's important at least that we keep that contextually in mind here about what we're actually seeing. It looks if you see big tree limbs down and you see flower buds that got killed by late spring frost, it looks really bad, but it's more of a dynamic change in the system rather than thinking about it from the individual tree's perspective as well.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, in terms of variability, I mean, we are seeing a lot of variability in a lot of the climate indicators, and increases in variability through time. And it's such a complex system, and there are so many pieces layered on top. Winter weather whiplash is kind of a class of extreme events that's now being called compounded extremes. So multiple things happening and are layered on top of each other to produce this other effect. And I think, the more we kind of go through the mental thought exercise of these kind of changes and the fluctuations and extremes, the more we realize how complex it is and need to do more research, and also think about how we could potentially adapt or figure out what to do about some of these changes to manage some of the resources better. So for example, days when we don't have snow cover and then it gets really cold and we have bare soil that's freezing can cause concrete frost, or if it then rains, it can really shift our runoff more quickly downhill into watersheds and have implications for flooding or nutrient transport. So there's really a lot layered on here, and the science is really digging into it, but variability is very much what's going on and a big potential issue, not just for forests, but across our ecosystems.
Great, thank you. Just a quick comment from Carbo. He said, we've seen higher levels of mortality from recent forest tent caterpillar defoliation than in the past. And so Carbo suggests it's due to the increasing combination of stresses, that compounded stressors that you mentioned, that are partially attributed to the impacts of climate change, the last straw concept. So yes, that's definitely part of the issue. I want to jump back to a question that Dan Hayes posed. This is to Jay. So he says, most of what you covered seems to be relevant to deciduous broadleaf trees. How are our evergreen needleleaf trees responding? And does warmer winters or longer growing seasons favor one over the other? In other words, how might the future of Maine's forest look in terms of changes in composition?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Dan. I think it's hard to say. So if you look at some of the early kind of simple ways we think about climate change and shifting species composition in the Northeast, for example, you look further south and say, well, we're going to have Virginia in 50 or 80 years, right? But we're not. I mean, look at everything that Sarah's talking about and all these really extreme fluctuations and different types of disturbances and things. So it's not quite as simple as we're just going to have warmer temperatures, so we're likely to have the species that are more likely adapted to those conditions. There's going to be an element of ability to respond dynamically to these highly or rapidly fluctuating conditions in spring and fall and winter, for example, that will be part of it. I mean, one of the things I think evergreen trees have going for them is they've got their leaves out and they're adapted to handle snow, right? Especially around here. And so those heavy snow load damaging effects are quite a bit less damaging to those types of species, and they don't have to time things quite as carefully there. So they put out their needles and they keep them out for several years. So there's documented evidence of evergreens actually photosynthesizing in the winter when conditions are right. They can actually take advantage of ideal conditions in the winter. Now, is that enough to offset or change competitive dynamics in the forest with hardwoods? I question that a little bit. I'm not sure if the magnitude of that effect is huge, but it gives them a leg up in some ways, where in the springtime they could take advantage of a warm month, and then as long as it doesn't get too cold and it doesn't really outweigh their kind of natural cold hardiness at that time of year, maybe they'd be okay with cold temperatures for another few weeks before spring really hit. So I don't have a good answer for you on that, Dan, but I think that's certainly an important point that we have to think about as we manage our forests, for sure.
All right, thanks, Jay. Let's see, Sarah, I'm actually going to ask you to click back to slide 15. I think it was, you had a question that came in much earlier. It was on Maine's warming winters, and I think it had the Jackman station graph. This sort of ties to Tom Charles's comment. He says, I've read that some climate models have predicted temporary, several decades, increased snowfall in colder regions as increased precipitation overcomes some of the warming. And then I'll ask the question relevant to this slide, but this might be a good backdrop. Do you have any quick response to Tom's comment about increased snowfall in colder regions and increased precip overcoming some of the warming?
Yeah, so that definitely has been shown to be happening in many places. So warmer air can hold more moisture, and we have seen some increases in snowfall in some studies that have been done around the region, and in other areas. So snowfall in some places is indeed increasing, but snow on the ground, which we in our study look at snow cover days, the number of days that actually have snow on the ground, or for there are some data sets that measure snowpack, including in Maine, the Maine Cooperative Snow Survey, the amount of snow on the ground. There may be more snow falling, but it's not sticking around. And the snowpack, the amount of snow on the ground, isn't as deep. So yeah, it's a little bit of it seems like a conflicting message. It may seem to be snowing more, but the snow isn't sticking around. But you're absolutely right. That's an important nuance.
Awesome. Thanks for clarifying, Sarah. And now I'll go back to Peter Nelson's question on this graph. I think it was on this graph. He says, do you think the slopes of the change lines for 10, 50, and 90th percentiles are the same, might be more stable than the mean?
That's a good question, and I haven't dug into that yet. So these results with sort of all the spaghetti around the lines are showing the result of multiple climate models. It's an ensemble kind of approach. You run all of the models and see where the average falls. There's certainly a lot of variability, and that's a good question. I haven't had a chance to really think through that, but I could get back to you, Peter. I know how to get in touch with you.
Thank you. Our last question of the day comes from Rich Bowden over in Pennsylvania. So he's asking, can you speculate on how these changes in forest conditions and potential changes in forest productivity will affect the forest industry? What should industry do in light of this information?
That's the big question. So that's the tough one. So that's what we're trying to get at. And I think a lot of my other research deals with what's happening during the growing season and the other challenges that trees are dealing with during the growing season. And I think that's where what we need to continue to get a better grasp of is what can the current existing forest handle? So what level of change can those existing forests handle? And at what point are our forests ready to potentially be transitioned to other species that can handle the conditions we expect in the future? I think we're getting there, but it's really hard to figure out what level of climate change an entire large canopy forest can withstand, because it's extremely hard to experimentally manipulate it. So that's why we have to get into the mechanisms of how these trees actually physically work and how they respond to extreme events. So I guess I'll say stay tuned on that one, but we're really working on it. I mean, so for example, we have a project right now looking at canopy red spruce trees that we've experimentally imposed a really extreme drought, and they're actually really resistant to an extreme drought. They can survive quite a long time with very little or no water, but all of their other functions basically shut down. So they can pretty much stop and hold pattern for a couple of months, but then what does that do to their competitiveness in that forest, for example? That's when we need to start understanding how we transition those forests versus just what are their survival thresholds in these new climate conditions.
Thanks. Sarah, any final comments on the landscape perspective?
I think that pretty much summed it up. Yeah.
All right, thank you. I know a few people need to jump off and move on to other exciting Zoom meetings. But before everybody goes, if you have a moment, please fill out this last poll. And also just a reminder, if you're looking for forester licensing credits, that Meg is going to send out the link to the certificate in the follow-up email. And Aaron, do you have any final words you want to share with everybody for the good of the order? We'll give Aaron a moment to come back on.
Nope, I just appreciate both Jay and Sarah for making the time to do this. We're excited for next month's seminar with Focus on Biodiversity with Amanda Cross and Aaron Simons-Lagarde. The recording and the presentation of this will be made available to everyone, and again, we'll ask for feedback. I appreciate Amanda for helping to make these more interactive and all the great discussion that the participants supported. So thanks for everyone, and if you have any ideas or suggestions, please just send them along to myself, Meg, or Amanda.
All right, thanks, Aaron. Thanks again to Sarah and to Jay. Thanks to Meg for all the behind the scenes work pulling this together. And thanks to everybody for participating. I really love how the comments that were coming into the chat window really echoed what the science that our presenters were sharing. So thanks everybody. Keep up your great work. And if you have questions, by all means, reach out to our presenters, to Aaron, Meg, myself, and we're really glad you joined us. Thanks, everybody.